Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A little not safe for work? Let's do it. People who have found a dead body. What's the story? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. In 1999, I woke up and said good morning to my wife and asked if she wanted a coffee. She didn't respond. I went to the kitchen, had breakfast and a coffee. I was getting ready to go to the store as we needed some provisions, and I went to tell my wife that I would be back in 45 minutes. As I walked through our front door, it dawned on me that she had never slept through me saying anything to her ever. I went back to our bedroom and touched her arm, and it was ice cold. As she was on her side, I rolled her over, and the side of her face on the pillow was black, blue, and red. This was a result of the blood pooling. I called 911, and they advised me to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I argued that this was unnecessary, as she was quite obviously dead. The 911 operator convinced me otherwise, and I started to give her mouth-to-mouth. I tasted death, as it was the worst tasting event of my life. I knew then that my beautiful wife was dead, and life as I knew it would be forever changed for the worse. The coroner told me that she died from an abscessed tooth that broke and entered her bloodstream. She had died about 6 hours earlier, and I never noticed. It will be 24 years on June 16th, and still think about her all the time. I was laying in bed watching TV with my girlfriend at the time, and her dad had moved in with us recently. Heard the loudest snoring ever coming out of his room real early, and we almost went to check on him, but figured he just had a long night and was exhausted. Got up, went through the day, breakfast chores, all the Saturday morning stuff we do. 2 p.m. rolls around, and he still hasn't come out of his room. Had a bad feeling, so I kicked the door in and found him sitting there in his underwear, pale bluish, white eyes and mouth open. Apparently he'd gone out with some friends, and they gave him some dope, which turned out to be mostly fentanyl. The snoring we heard was the death rattle, and he was already dead before we even went to sleep. I was lucky enough to not have to find my father or stepfather when they took their own lives, but I had to help police navigate to the spot. My stepdad did it. I did, however, find my grandmother when she passed. We were really close most of my life, and I had moved in with her while I was sobering up and going through a divorce. She had started progressing in her dementia, and honestly, taking care of her was exactly what I needed at that moment. I don't know if I could have done it for anyone else, but it was kind of cathartic, and that I was helping feed this woman who taught me how to use a fork. She was pleasant most of the time, but she'd get scared when she was confused and didn't know where or what was going on. So I'd just have to snuggle up on my shoulder and tell her stories about us in a calm voice until she felt better, remembering how many times she'd done that for me. I had gotten an opportunity to move and do some dream work in my dream city, so my mother was going to take over caring for her when I moved. I was all packed, had the car loaded and everything, when I went to wake her to say goodbye. She was laying on the floor beside the bed. I called out her name and no response. I rushed over to see if I needed to do CPR, and when I laid my hand on her arm, she was cold to the touch. I literally Googled what to do when you find Grandma dead, then called the non-emergency line. The police and EMT came to pronounce her, and the coroner's office stopped by. Then the funeral home came to get her. My grandma had given me one last gift on her way out, a chance to finally grieve a natural death after a life very well lived, and the peace of knowing I wasn't leaving her behind. You and me, Grandma. You and me. I mean, there is some comfort in this story. Still sorry for your loss. Hope the job worked out in your dream city. Someone I know retired from the Royal Mail because he found someone. He looked through the letterbox of an elderly lady who usually came to the door for him, but he hadn't seen in a week. She had had a stroke and fallen on a plug and heater. This is the classic domestic violence story of man kills woman because if I can't have her, nobody else will story. At 14, I woke up to find my mother with a shotgun hole in her chest under the kitchen table and her murderer outside under the clothesline with his brains blown out. The only difference between this and other stories like this is I'm the kid who wasn't murdered with her mother. My boyfriend was a Marine veteran who served in Afghanistan. I went to go pick up lunch because he hadn't eaten all day and just said goodbye to his nana who was on life support in the hospital. I asked him to come with me. He said he'd rather be alone. I figure he didn't want me to see him grieving, but that he'd put coffee on for us. I got back to his house, smelled the coffee, called his name, then saw that the dog was sitting in the hallway, ears pinned back and wouldn't move. I looked in the living room and found him on the floor. I thought he was napping. The brain is a hell of a thing. He sometimes slept on the floor, so instead of noticing the gore, my brain told me he was napping. I told him to get up. Lunch was here. He didn't move or respond. I went closer and noticed his body was in a weird position to be comfortable for sleeping. I ran over, saw blood coming from his nose, his eyes wide open and stained yellow. Then I realized I was inches from kneeling in his brain matter and shattered skull. He told me his gun was locked up. Told his dad he didn't even have his gun at the house. Effed me up forever. And I'll never stop regretting leaving him alone. End veteran suicide. Rest in sweetest peace, my Joe. I was a caregiver for a few months, and during that time, I primarily took care of a man in his 60s who had dementia after suffering a stroke. This guy could barely speak and had no idea what year it was, and as a result, couldn't really communicate what he was feeling. He had a sister who loved him, but basically did nothing for him besides take his disability money. I started noticing something strange a few days before it happened. He was weirdly quiet and wasn't having BMs. One night I put him to bed at the end of my shift at 8 p.m. and drove home. I remember it was pissing rain, and I was listening to Riders on the Storm, LOL, and I felt like something bad was going to happen. The next morning I came into my shift at 9 a.m., and my client's sister was on her way out to run errands or something, and I came inside and started to get my client's meds ready and clocked in. I then walked over to my client's room and opened the door. The first thing I noticed was a sweet fragrance, and I saw my client in the dark with his hand up in the air like he was grabbing something. I figured he had finally had a BM at night, and I would have to clean it up. So I walked over to him and noticed he was completely still and had vomit all over his chest, and his mouth was agape with his eyes open. I reached over to his hand, and to my horror, it was unbelievably cold. Any of you who have felt a dead body know what I mean. It just feels so effing wrong to the touch. So I called 911. I told them what happened. Meanwhile, I'm sobbing and just fully having a mental breakdown. The cops come and interview me. They asked the sister the last time she had checked on him. She told him that she saw him last night when I was putting him to bed at 8 p.m. She had not checked on him at all that night. For 13 hours, he was in bed without anyone checking in on him. The autopsy said he had had a massive heart attack that night, and based on how cold he was, I'm guessing he had died shortly after I left. Shit haunts me to this day. My freshman year of college, right during winter finals, my closest college friend who liked to prank me was in his bed, ignoring his alarm. His roommate came to get me to wake him up. It was a lofted bed. I figured it was a setup. I climbed up there and immediately knew something was horribly wrong and yelled for someone to call for help. His face is still burned into my mind over 20 years later. I would describe it as scared, with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape as if he were gasping or trying to scream. His hands gripped his sheets tightly. An hour plus of attempts to revive him in the dorm hallway failed. We found out later that he grew up with heart-related issues and his aorta tore in his sleep before his 19th birthday. Before we learned the cause, I barely slept for weeks. I was terrified whatever got him was getting me next because we spent so much time together. All these years later, and I'm still in loose contact with his family. My mom wasn't answering her phone on Mother's Day. It wasn't abnormal, as she had been like that ever since my dad passed away in May of 2018. This year was the 5-year anniversary of his passing, and on the day would have been 55 years of marriage had he not passed. Her neighbor messaged me saying he couldn't get a hold of her. That's when I knew something was wrong. Her neighbor was close with her and was always there helping her. I think he secretly had a thing for her, as they were both the same age. She always answered him, even if she didn't want to be bothered. I drove over there earlier than I was supposed to. She was deaf, so she couldn't talk on the phone, but she would always text. I walked in the house and didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I walked into the back bedroom of her second-floor master bedroom, and as I started going through the door, I saw her knees on the bed, so I thought she was just sitting there. As I walked a little closer, I saw a gun in her lap. I knew what had happened. I called the police and got out of the house and threw up on the front lawn. I'm a disabled Army vet. I've seen some effed up things. I've never seen anything like that. It's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I can't unsee it. Every day I wake up and see her laying there, blood and brain matter all over everything. She had tricked her neighbor into loading the gun for her, so he felt horrible too. It was just all around awful. I was 8 years old. Came home from school to find my dad had come home early from work. Went into the house, saw a wallet and wedding ring on kitchen table, and found him dead in my bed clutching my teddy bear. Oh, that was a lot of years ago, but forever crystal clear. On my way to work at 3:30 in the morning, I was carpooling with two other guys. We were going through Walcott, Connecticut. Anyone that knows that area knows there's a lot of woods. Anyway, I noticed brake lights that were illuminated behind some trees, so I pulled over to check it out. It was this red SUV blasting reggaeton. The driver had his head slumped down like he was sleeping. I noticed about 20 open beers in the back seat, so we thought he was just drunk. We started to knock on the door to wake him up while we waited for the cops to show up. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up. Officer goes to the driver's side and turns on his flashlight. The second it turned on, we immediately saw the bullet holes on the side of the driver's side door. In like less than a minute, there were at least 10 cop cars shutting everything down. I'm really sorry. That's an image that will clearly stay with you forever. I hope you guys are doing all right and that your dad found some peace. I was 21. I woke up around 9:30 or 10. I peeked in my mom's room to say good morning. Her TV was on, but she wasn't there. She liked to use the bathroom in the master bedroom if it was available. More privacy, I guess. And the door to the master was cracked, so I figured, oh, she's in the bathroom. Let me take the dogs outside to do their thing. Well, about 10 minutes later, I come back inside and she's still not in her room. So I go peek inside the master to see if she's feeling okay. It's dark, and I can see her asleep on a recliner. So I call out, Mom, a few times quietly and then go to nudge her knee, and she is ice effing cold. I finally look up at her face and realize she's dead and has been for a while, maybe a few hours. Mouth hanging open, staring into nothing. She's completely pale and her lips were blue. It was the most traumatic thing I've ever experienced, and it has really effed me up. That woman was my absolute best friend in the entire world. They said she had had a heart attack. It will be 7 years this July, and the thought of seeing her like that still makes my anxiety skyrocket. I came home to find my roommate dead in the bathtub after she intentionally took a lot of epilepsy pills and likely seized in the tub and drowned. That hurt a lot. Was out driving one night in college with my ex. We used to just go on long drives together to talk about stuff and get away from the university. We were maybe 45 minutes into the country under a pitch black sky filled with stars and came over a hill to see two red taillights off in a field. It was so dark that was all we could see until we got closer and saw it was a car crashed directly into a willow tree, and the driver was all mangled and dead in the driver's seat, partially out the windshield. We called the cops, but since it was in the middle of nowhere, it took a bit to get service and then a bit longer for them to get to us. Saddest thing about it was that the driver was a teenager. I was 3 or 4 and didn't really understand what was going on. The long and short is that someone got shot in a drive-by, took off running, and collapsed under my bedroom window. I found him in the morning and told my mom. She went out to look, and then I remember being swept up and taken into the other room. A bunch of cops came, but that's about all I really remember. A few years ago, I saw a body lying face down in the River Clyde. It was early morning as I was on my way to work, and they had got tangled up in some rocks. Some other people walking along the path also saw them, and I had to stop them from trying to get down to the body. You could tell from the way the body was bloated that they couldn't be saved, and I phoned the police to come. It was a weird day in work after that. I was maybe 12 or 13, walking to the local convenience store with friends. We took a path through the woods that ends up behind a neighborhood pool fence and eventually brings you to the back of the store. Body was laying behind the store in the grass. Called 911 on the payphone out front. turned out to be a tutor or teacher whose student of hers, who also lived in the neighborhood, had strangled to death and dumped the body. My best friend hung himself from the monkey bars in his backyard with a dog leash. I found him hanging there and tried to save him, but by holding his legs and lifting him up, vomit all over me, and that smell, ugh. I moved to a different state years later, and in high school I had a teacher who was talking about how one of his students in the state I came from died via dog leash hanging. Turned out to be the same kid. My then teacher was the principal of the school my friend attended, and my friend was always in trouble in the principal's office, so they knew each other well. A few years after I graduated, the teacher was arrested for charges of statutory sex offense and taking indecent liberties with a child, an effing 3-year-old. I still think he had something to do with my friend's suicide. There was a terrible accident on the freeway on a holiday weekend. An SUV with a cargo full of cousins was pulled to the side with some sort of mechanical issue. A semi, whose driver was hopped up on meth, hit the back of the SUV. Because none of the kids were seatbelted, 2 were thrown out of the vehicle. One landed in the middle of the freeway and was instantly dead. The other was further out, and I found her. Her neck was obviously broken, and how do I say this gracefully, she wasn't in one piece. It was horrible and traumatic, and I'll never forget my 911 call and the horror of seeing an 8-year-old like that. I was going to testify, but the driver pled out. Gabby and Gracie were their names. I typically like to enjoy my cup of coffee early in the morning while I skate around the park near me. On the day after Halloween, I went through my normal routine but come across a body hanging in a tree. At first I thought it was a very realistic decoration or prank, but as I got closer, it was clearly a dead body. He had left his bike and a backpack next to the tree stump. I did not feel the need to go through his belongings. I kind of froze up for a second there until the jogger came by and her reaction snapped me back into reality. We called emergency services, and they came shortly after and cleaned up. When I told my friend and boss what happened, it took them a while to believe my story, since they all thought it was leftover Halloween decorations. I don't know why the 911 call wasn't convincing enough. I kept looking on the internet to find an obituary or an article related to the situation for proof, but nothing came out as far as I could tell. Worked in an apartment complex of around 100 units. We had warned all the tenants we would be lubricating the locks and taking the time to fix or change some as well as other maintenance stuff for the door and hinges. I was on my last floor. I was dreading one door as the old man living there liked to chat, and he would have been following me in the corridor for the rest of the floor. Knocked a few times, didn't get an answer. I unlocked the door and announced myself as I tried to get in. I met some resistance. He was an odd guy who used to do some job back in the 50s or 60s and told me he didn't trust anyone because of things he saw. So I assumed he was sleeping, and he put a chair behind the door. I closed it and went for the other apartments. Time came for his apartment. Last one. Knocked again and still no answer. I knew he left once a day around noon for his daily shopping. I unlocked the door, announcing myself again while struggling to open the door. The chair was holding the door pretty well, and I didn't want to damage it, so I pried enough for me to squeeze through. Past the door. It closes behind me, and there was no chair. The guy was dead behind the door. I didn't even check to see if he was hurt. I knew instantly he was gone. Felt like my legs had been swept under me, but I was still standing. I calmly, and I say that as what I think I look like, I probably wasn't, called the police to explain I had just found someone dead. The operator asked me to do CPR, went through the steps with me, but I couldn't. I knew he was dead, and probably had been for almost a day. The operator told me the police were on their way. I moved the guy just enough so I could open the door normally. Some tenants steps out, super joyous. What a lovely day, me faking a smile. Went down to wait for the police and showed them where he was. Turns out he died of old age or age-related incident, and there was nothing I could have done even if I was there when it happened. Told me he probably took a shit, got up and died on the spot since he was near the bathroom. I was working alone that day. Boss had left on vacation, and I was the only worker for the week. The co-owner of the building arrived by chance about 30 minutes into my questioning by police. Didn't even think to call him. He took care of the rest. I left, walked a bit, and got myself a juicy burger. I was traumatized for a few weeks until we decided to renovate the place after the legal stuff was over, and I faced my fears by going back inside that apartment.